Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is beloved author Alexander McCall Smith. And Sandy, I don't use the word beloved lightly. People feel so connected to you. They want to go to dinner with you, they want to play golf with you.
Well, I didn't think they realize how bad a golfer I am.
Do you think through your books and through your characters that you've created sort of this extended family of like-minded and like-hearted people?
Yes, I think so. I think this involves doing two things. You create the characters, the list of characters, and I feel that that exists. There are these people who populate my novels, and I can have conversations with them, so to speak, when I write the books. But it also brings one into contact with a whole lot of readers all over the world, and that's a wonderful thing. That I regard as a very great privilege, to be able to speak to people about the books and about other subjects. It gives us something in common, and I feel that it's an immense privilege to be able to go to various parts in the world and discover that one has friends, people with whom one shares an interest in the characters, and that's wonderful.
I think your readers also feel a very keen sense of ownership with your characters. Do you get a lot of suggestions on what needs to happen in these character stories?
I certainly do, yes, and most of it is very useful. Occasionally you get advice which you can't use, so sometimes people want to dispose one of the characters. I had somebody writing to me and suggesting that one of the characters, who's a rather narcissistic character in the Scotland Street series, Bruce, that he should have an accident, preferably involving a steamroller. So I felt that was a little bit uncharitable, and I wouldn't do it. But you're quite right mentioning ownership. I think that once you create literary characters, you have to be prepared to relinquish ownership of them. They belong to the readers then.
You're a medical ethicist, and your first writings were actually scholarly writings. When did you first get friendly with Precious Ramotswe?
Well, I started writing the Precious Ramotswe books. I think it must have been about 1996 that I sat down and I wrote a short story, or what I thought would be a short story, about Precious Ramotswe, about this woman who starts a little detective agency in Botswana. And then I found that I rather liked the character, and so I made it into a book. And the book was first published in Scotland in 1998. So that was the beginning of this rather long literary conversation that I've had with Precious Ramotswe.
Did Precious bring anything to your writing that had been missing up to that point?
I think so, yes. I think that I found my voice when I started writing the Precious Ramotswe books. Prior to that, I'd written quite a number of short stories, and I'd written a lot of books for children. But this was the first time that I started to write full-length novels, and somehow she enabled me to find what I think is my real literary voice.
Were your university colleagues surprised at all when you published the #1 Ladies Detective Agency?
Yes, I think they were a little bit. They took the view that this was a slightly eccentric thing to do. Interestingly enough, I published the #1 Ladies Detective Agency in 1998, and in 1998 I was spending a period of 6 months or so as a visiting professor at SMU in Dallas, Texas. And I had a number of friends there in Dallas whom I'd made in a previous spell as a visiting professor at Southern Methodist. And we had the launch party in Dallas. So Ma Ramotswe was actually launched in Dallas, and we had a party of about 40 people, many of whom were friends from SMU, from the law school where I was working. And obviously it was done on a very small scale. There weren't many copies published. So that's rather interesting. She has a connection with a neighboring state.
Did you know right from the beginning that Precious and her story was going to be bigger than just the one book?
I think I realized after the publication of the first book. There was a spell of about 6 months or so during which we got some fairly generous reviews, and the books sold in a very modest way, but nonetheless they were managing to sell most of the small edition that they published. And that's the point at which I thought, well, maybe I should return to the #1 Ladies Detective Agency and do a second book. I didn't at that stage think that I would end up doing one. I've just written the 13th. But nonetheless, it became apparent to me that there might be possibilities for expanding the world of Precious Ramotswe.
That 13th book, which has just been released, is the Limpopo Academy of Private Detection. And in this book, suddenly, Precious, who has all these other things to contend with, is having haunting dreams.
Yes, she dreams that she sees a stranger who's standing underneath a tree, and he comes towards her and says, "I've eventually come to see you," and she's not sure what this dream means. So she discusses that with her assistant, Ma Makutsi, who comes up with all sorts of odd suggestions. And then eventually she does meet this man, and it transpires that this person, the stranger who's come to see her, is a person whom she has long admired for his authorship of a particular book, a manual of private detection. And so Clovis Anderson walks into her life.
You've been alluding to this person throughout the series. Did you always know that he and Precious were going to have this meeting?
I've been thinking about it for a few years. It's occurred to me that maybe one day Clovis Anderson should come and meet Mara Matsui, and now it's happened. And of course I had to decide, with Clovis Anderson, I had to decide where he came from, and I decided that he actually came from Muncie, Indiana.
That's good. You've got a lot of American associations. There's trouble on the orphan farm.
Yes, there is a bit of trouble on the orphan farm because Ma Potawatomi, that wonderful matron of the orphan farm, is running into difficulties with a new member of the Board of Trustees, and she doesn't see things in quite the same light as this man. So that's really very serious because Ma Potawatomi is a wonderful matron. She looks after the interests of the orphans in a most determined fashion, and obviously we can't let anything serious happen to her, but it becomes a fairly close-run thing.
Booklist has said that what makes these books so brilliant is that these seemingly tiny cases go on to be important considerations of love, greed, ambition. Which of those forces are at work in this new book?
Well, we've got, I suppose, we've got ambition. We've got a certain amount of disloyalty or deception because Ma Makutsi and her husband are building a house and they run into trouble with the builder. Not a coincidence, perhaps, that I should talk about that because we've recently had troubles with a builder in respect of a project that we had in Scotland. So I've been able to get it out of my system by writing about it, transferring it to Botswana. Writers do that.
What is it about Precious that continues to intrigue you after 13 books?
I think I'm still attracted by her character and I'm attracted by her world, and I think that the issues that she raised right at the beginning of the series, the issues of kindness and forgiveness that she stands for, are still there, and in fact probably even more important than they ever were. Because I think forgiveness, for example, which Mara Matsui certainly embodies, is a value that somehow I think is being squeezed out. We've become very recriminatory in society. We've become very keen to blame people and to punish people, whereas in fact forgiveness is a very, very important message. Now obviously you can't forgive everything immediately, but nonetheless it's a way of enabling life to go on. And I think many situations where you have people at loggerheads with one another, the power of forgiveness actually can be quite important. And the difficulty is, I think, that in the past we've had that message which has been put across, for example, by the churches. They've talked about forgiveness, but in societies where those voices either aren't listened to or aren't there anymore, who's teaching kids about these values? It's quite a consideration.
She has all these admirable qualities. Does she have any weaknesses?
I think she probably does. Not many. She probably has some weaknesses, one of which is her view that the things that she believes to be the case, she will say that is well known, and say that really settles the matter. She also attributes many of her views on things to the late President Seretse Khama, and she says he would have done this. Of course, she has no evidence that he would have done that. So there are those weaknesses, but they're very small weaknesses. She's got a weakness for donuts. She likes donuts.
And bush tea.
And bush tea. Well, bush tea, of course, that's not a weakness that one would particularly worry about. because bush tea is so good for you. But I think donuts might not perhaps be in the same category.
Well, maybe not, but when Grace had to break the news to her that she didn't really like bush tea,
That was trouble.
It was a really pivotal scene. Speaking of Grace, you have a wonderful supporting cast of characters in this series. Who are your particular favorites?
Well, I'm quite keen on Mr. Joby Marconi. He's a great man, the mechanic. He represents solidity, and he's always there, and he always does the right thing, and he's a very nice man. He's a little bit indecisive from time to time. I like Ma Potapani, the matron of the orphan farm. She's actually inspired by a Rel character who was a Rel matron of the small orphanage outside Gaborone in Botswana that I used to visit, and they had this marvelous matron who was a very large, expansive figure, and she made fruit cake just as the fictional one makes fruit cake. So I think she's a very attractive supporting character.
Do you think she'll ever write her book on how to run an orphan farm?
I don't think so, no.
Well, I still have high hopes for that. And of course, that we have to talk about Botswana, the homeland for all these great characters. What is it about Botswana that makes it seem magical and a little bit intimidating at the same time?
Well, it's a very remarkable country. It's probably the best run country in sub-Saharan Africa. It's probably the only non-corrupt country in sub-Saharan Africa. The other countries, I'm afraid, have major problems with corruption, but Botswana really is very uncorrupt, which is great. So it's a very well-run country. It's a country where the rule of law has been observed all the way through, and where human rights have generally been well respected. I mean, obviously every country has its little failings here and there, but generally speaking, Botswana has done fairly well in that respect. And I think that all probably goes back to the character of the people. The people are cautious people, and I think the reason why they're cautious is that they occupy quite dry land on the edge of the land that can be cultivated. And I think that if you are an agricultural people surviving in those really harsh conditions, you develop a whole lot of values of caution and I suppose husbandry, which all add up.
How well have these books been received in Botswana?
People in Botswana have been very generous about them. I mean, obviously there'll be some people who don't like them, but many people seem to be happy with the picture that it portrays, that the series portrays of Botswana. I think that quite a few people are very pleased that it portrays the country in a positive light, because so many people in Africa are used to outsiders coming along, looking at their country and saying, oh, there are all sorts of difficulties here, and finding fault with it. These books don't find fault with it. They say this is a remarkable country, and the people of this country, rather like Mara Matswe, have reason to be proud of their country, and I think that's fine.
It was wonderful seeing the visual images of Botswana in the HBO mini-series. How involved were you with that series?
Well, not very involved. I was technically a consultant to the film, but that means nothing. And so I saw the scripts and I visited the set, but the scripts were written by somebody else, and so I saw the film being made. I thought they did it very well.
What about the casting?
I had no role in the casting. People thought that I did, and so wherever I went, I was pursued by traditionally built African actresses who said, I'm Mara Matswe, here's my portfolio, please consider me. But of course I had no real role. I was able to pass on suggestions to the film people, but they were doing their own casting. They had casting agents, and they were looking in all sorts of places, and in fact they were finding it very difficult to find the right person, and then fairly shortly before they started filming, they got Jill Scott, who's by way of being a jazz singer, a very accomplished jazz singer, and she played Mara Matswe really very well, and Annika Noni Rose did Mama Kutsi, and Lucien M. Samati did the character of Mr. Joby Marconi, and they did it very well indeed.
You think there'll be a sequel?
Well, they're talking about doing 2 made-for-television films, 2 feature lengths. Yeah, I hope they do. They're certainly they've got writers working on them, script writers working on them. So I hope that happens.
And you've got other series. In fact, you're working on these series as we speak. Let's talk about the serialized, the newspaper serializations first. 44 Scotland Street, Corduroy Mansions.
Yes, well, those have been serial novels written in newspapers, published in newspapers, then published as books. And that's something which I've very much enjoyed. Scotland Street, I'm currently writing volume 8 of the series, so it's been going for 8 years. And it's a different form of writing because it's a short chapter a day, about 1,100 words a chapter, and I have to write one every day. So it keeps you on your toes, and of course it has a different episodic nature from a conventional novel. You'd have all sorts of things happening, all sorts of characters brought in, all sorts of observations on a wide range of subjects. It's really quite an interesting thing from the author's point of view.
And then just today you finished another book and another installment in the Sunday Philosophy Club.
Yes, yes, that's right. I write when I'm on tour, and I put the finishing touches to a final chapter today, which is very nice.
You don't get distracted when you're out on tour?
Not really, not really. There are islands of time in the middle of the tour, and I use those for writing. I also write on planes. I have no difficulty writing on a plane.
Well, that's amazing.
Well, it's
You're speaking to someone who has writer's block all the time, so I'm real impressed. But Isabel Dahlhaus is just a wonderful character. In what ways does she complement Precious?
Well, I think she's quite similar to Precious from Monthsbury in that she's concerned about the sort of fundamental questions of how we should live our lives. I think that comes across with both of them, although she's a little bit different from Myra Monthsbury in that Myra Monthsbury proceeds on the basis of intuition. She's a very intuitive person, and she often gets that right. Her intuitions don't fail her, whereas Isabel is much more formal in the way she thinks, and she looks at problems as somebody who's formally trained in philosophy, and that doesn't do her much good because she often gets the wrong answer. So there's that difference.
I've got to tell you that the series of yours I've just discovered, we were talking about it earlier, is Portuguese Irregular Verbs. Just finished reading The Finer Points of Sausage Dogs. It is hysterical. I mean, this German professor in Fayetteville, Arkansas, who's mistaken for a veterinarian, it is just a scream. Do you have fun writing those books?
I had great fun writing those books. I really enjoyed writing them. They're so ridiculous. They're completely ridiculous, but as I say, very good fun to write. These German professors, 3 German professors, it's not that I'm picking on German professors in particular, it's just that German professors are the most privileged of all professors. They have lots of assistants who can do their work for them, and they can only be removed by Act of Parliament. So that's a very good situation to be. Oh,
absolutely.
I think to get a job where the only way getting you out is through Act of Parliament is terrific. So they are quite a privileged bunch. And I had a number of friends who were German professors, and so I started to write those stories as a tribute to my friends.
Did they see themselves reflected in these characters?
They didn't. When I wrote the first book, Portuguese Irregular Verbs, I sent it off to my great friend, Professor Zimmermann, in Germany, who's by way of being the godfather of our younger daughter. And I said, Reinhard, here we are. Here's a book that I've written about German professors who can't play tennis, because Reinhard himself is a German professor who can play tennis very well. He's a very strong tennis player. And he wrote back and said, that's very funny. And he then, when I published the book, because originally I published it myself, we printed 500 copies. He bought 250 of these, and he sent them off to all his German professorial friends. And a number of them wrote to me and said, yes, this is very interesting. We can see these people. We know many people just like that. None of them saw themselves, of course. But then we never do.
There are 3 books in the series that are available in the U.S., but you tell me there's a 4th book, and rumor has it has something to do with olive oil.
Yes, I've written a 4th book in the series. The first 3 volumes in the Portuguese Irregular Verb series are Portuguese Irregular Verbs, The Finer Points of Sausage Dogs, and the 3rd one was At the Villa of Reduced Circumstances. And I've now written this 4th volume, which is called Unusual Uses for Olive Oil, and it's marginally concerned with olive oil.
How do you keep all of these series straight in your mind?
Well, I have to be aware when I sit down to write as to what series I'm in and which fictional universe I'm entering, and I think that's quite important. Generally speaking, I've managed to do that, to keep them separate, although there was one case where Precious from Motsbury got mixed up with Isabel Dalhousie. I'd sent a script to my editor in New York, Edward Kastenmeier, and he said, take a look at page 75 or whatever it is. And he said, I think you'll see that Mara Motsbury's beginning to sound like Isabel Dalhousie. And indeed I read it, and he was absolutely right. I'd slipped between the characters, so I was able to sort it out.
Do these characters become real to you?
Yes, they do. They become presences. They're not with me all the time, but they're there in the background. And certainly I find, say, with Mara Motsbury, that if I find myself about to think or say anything uncharitable, a voice says to me, well, what would Mara Motsbury think of your doing that? And then I feel ashamed, and I don't do it. So she's a bit of a conscience sitting on my shoulder.
If you were wanting to have fun with one of your characters, which character would you choose to spend a day with?
That's a very interesting question. I suppose I spend so much time with them anyway, because I'm writing about them, that I feel that I spend vast quantities of time with them. But if I thought that they might become real, and they may need to be, I would probably go for Isabel Dalhousie, I think, because I think she and I have got a number of common interests. So I might well opt to be with her. But it would be great fun to be with Mara Motsbury. Mama Coetzee would be great fun.
Oh, I think so.
She'd keep her on your toes. Yes, I think she'd be rather fun as well.
And you could go shopping for shoes.
That's right, yes.
What if you were looking for inspiration? What character would you call?
If I were looking for inspiration, I think I might call on one of my characters from Scotland Street, Angus Lordy, who's a portrait painter in Scotland Street. I think he might be good from that point of view.
And we can't forget Freddie from Corduroy Mansions.
Freddie's a wonderful dog, wonderful dog. I find it extremely interesting speculating on what goes on in a dog's mind. And I know it's somewhat unusual in fiction, but I do have these canine characters, and I do think about what they're thinking about. Because obviously dogs have emotions. You see them feeling cheerful or excited or sad, guilty indeed. I think one can see those in a dog's mind. They must also have plans of action. They must have intentions, because you see them behaving in an intentional fashion. But beyond that, what do they think of? I find that extremely interesting. There are books on the subjects, which I think can give us some clue as to what dogs think. But I often spend my time when writing about my canine characters trying to put myself into the dog's skin. And dogs are very interested in human affairs. They're very interested in what we're doing, but they don't quite get it. They look a little bit puzzled. They're trying to work out what all this action is. And they love it when people are milling around and doing things. Dogs think that is very, very good, but they don't really see why.
Well, Freddie's pretty insightful. We've been talking about your adult books so far, but you're a children's writer as well. And tell us about The Great Cake Mystery.
The Great Cake Mystery is a children's book, which deals with Precious from Motsbury's first case. As a child of 8, as a girl of 8, people had said to me, why don't you write about Precious from Motsbury when she was small? And I thought, well, why not? And I did that, and I discovered that I really rather enjoyed writing about the young Precious from Motsbury. And it deals with an issue about disappearing cakes at the school she attends, and how she deals with that, and how she shows her qualities as a detective, as an incipient detective even at that stage.
As I told you earlier, Sandy, we've got some young people in Tulsa who are reading your Akimbo books. What would you like to say to them?
Well, I'd say thank you very much for reading the books, and I hope that you enjoy these descriptions in the Akimbo books of Africa, and that it might inspire you to go and read a little bit more about life in Africa. I'd say that. And then the other thing that I would say to them is keep reading, because reading is just such a wonderful pleasure, and I think it's marvelous if children acquire the habit of reading. It will be something which will stay with them, or could stay with them for the rest of their lives. And so I would say encourage them to continue.
We've covered so many of your books. When do you have time to do anything but write?
Well, I tend to have to write most days. So there are very few days that I have where I consider myself not to be on duty as a writer. And that is self-inflicted, so I can't complain about that. I can't moan about it, because it's my own fault that that's arisen. And that's because I write quite a number of books, and therefore I have quite a tight schedule. I just probably don't have a great deal of time other than the time that I spend writing.
But you told me earlier that you do have some diversions. Tell us about your boat.
Yes, well, I love messing about with boats. There's a wonderful line in Kenneth Grahame's Wind in the Willows where one of the characters says to the other, there's no greater pleasure than simply messing about in boats. And I think that is true. I enjoy that greatly. So I've got a boat in the west coast of Scotland, in the Highlands, where we have a house. And I can spend a lot of time, I can waste a lot of time in the boat. Boats are very good ways of wasting time. You can spend hours doing nothing in particular, going nowhere in particular as well, but just very satisfactory.
What to you would be a perfect day?
A perfect day would probably start with a good, appropriate breakfast, the sort of breakfast that I like to have. Then I would probably go off in a boat for a while and have a bit of fun in a boat. I'd come back and have lunch, and then I would have an afternoon sleep, and then get up at 4 in the afternoon, have some tea, then go for a walk, something of that sort, so one doesn't feel too guilty, and then have friends round for conversation and a glass of wine and a casual dinner, but with friends and the conversation that friends bring. That would be wonderful. And we talk about all sorts of important things. We wouldn't talk about the things that don't matter. So we wouldn't talk about the weather or also about house prices. We would talk about really important things about the soul and so on. That would be a very good day.
It would be. It sounds like a wonderful day. Thank you so much for being here, Sandy.
Thank you, Teresa.
And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.